February 2002, Salt Lake City, Utah. The world's greatest winter athletes gathered under bright lights and roaring crowds for the Winter Olympics. Among them was a 24-year-old Canadian snowboarder with Olympic dreams burning in his chest. He competed in the parallel giant slalom, representing his nation on the biggest stage an athlete could imagine. The cameras captured his focus intensity, his athletic prowess, his determination. What they didn't capture was the double life already taking root in his mind. Ryan Wedding returned home from Salt Lake City without a medal, but he gained something far more valuable to his future criminal empire: connections, international travel experience, and most importantly, the perfect cover story. Who would suspect an Olympic athlete of building a drug trafficking network? The answer, for far too long, was nobody. By 2024, that same Olympian will be named to the FBI's MostWanted list, accused of orchestrating a massive cocaine trafficking operation that moved hundreds of kilograms of drugs across 3 countries and left multiple bodies in its wake. But the path from Olympic hopeful to international fugitive didn't happen overnight. It was a carefully calculated descent into a world where loyalty meant nothing and violence was just another business expense. Wedding's criminal enterprise began modestly enough in the years following his Olympic appearance. He maintained connections in both Canada and the United States, traveling freely across borders, his athletic reputation opening doors that would remain closed to ordinary criminals. Investigators would later discover that he'd been building relationships with Mexican cartel contacts, establishing supply lines, and creating a sophisticated distribution network that stretched from Southern California to the Canadian border. The operation was brilliantly conceived. Wedding used his legitimate background as cover, maintaining the appearance of a former athlete trying to find his post-competition purpose. He invested in businesses that could launder money. He cultivated relationships with people who had access to transportation networks. He built a crew of trusted associates who handled the dangerous ground-level work while he orchestrated from a distance, always careful to keep his hands seemingly clean. But cocaine trafficking at this scale requires more than just business acumen. It requires enforcement. It requires a willingness to use violence to protect territory, eliminate competition, and silence anyone who might cooperate with law enforcement. And Ryan Wedding proved he was willing to cross every line necessary to protect his empire. The first murder connected to Wedding's organization shocked investigators. A young man in Ontario, someone on the periphery of the drug trade, was found shot to death in what appeared to be a targeted killing. At the time, police couldn't connect it to the former Olympian. There was no obvious link, no smoking gun. But it was the first crack in Wedding's carefully constructed facade. More violence followed. Bodies appeared in different jurisdictions, making it difficult for any single law enforcement agency to see the full pattern. A dealer who owed money, a courier who'd been arrested and might cooperate, a rival trying to move in on Wedding's territory. Each death was isolated enough to avoid drawing attention to a broader network, but together they painted a picture of an organization willing to kill anyone who threatened its profits. Meanwhile, the cocaine flowed steadily northward. Hundreds of kilograms crossed from Mexico into California, then made their way up the coast to Canada. The operation generated millions in cash, money that had to be laundered through legitimate businesses and financial channels. Wedding's network had become sophisticated enough to rival established cartels, and his reputation in the criminal underworld grew even as his Olympic achievements faded from public memory. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border had begun noticing patterns. The DEA tracked shipments. Canadian authorities investigated murders. But connecting everything to Ryan Wedding required years of painstaking investigation, wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperation between multiple agencies. The former Olympian had built his empire carefully, and dismantling it would require extraordinary effort. Then, in early 2024, everything changed. Federal agents executed a coordinated operation across multiple states and provinces. Arrest warrants were issued. Co-conspirators were taken into custody. And when investigators finally pieced together the full scope of Wedding's criminal enterprise, what they discovered was far worse than anyone had imagined. But Ryan Wedding himself was nowhere to be found. He'd vanished, likely fleeing to Mexico where he had cartel protection. The FBI placed him on their most wanted list, offering a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. His face, once seen competing for national glory, now stared out from wanted posters as a fugitive accused of drug trafficking and multiple murders. The indictment revealed shocking details. Wedding and his associates had allegedly transported over 700 kilograms of cocaine. They'd murdered at least 3 people, possibly more. They'd operated with impunity for years, hidden behind Wedding's legitimate past and sophisticated operational security. The total value of the drugs moved through his network exceeded $1 billion. But as federal agents closed in and associates began cooperating, one question haunted everyone involved in the investigation. How had an Olympic athlete, someone who'd represented his country on the world stage, become one of North America's most dangerous drug traffickers? And more chilling, what had he been willing to do to protect his empire? The answer to that question would emerge in the evidence collected by investigators, and would reveal that the violence connected to Wedding's organization was far more extensive and brutal than anyone had initially suspected. Chapter 2. The investigation that would ultimately expose Ryan Wedding's criminal empire began not with sophisticated surveillance or high-tech forensics, but with a single phone call that changed everything. In April 2024, police in Ontario responded to reports of gunfire in a quiet residential neighborhood. What they found was a scene of calculated execution that would eventually unravel an international drug network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 2 victims lay dead inside a modest home, both shot multiple times at close range. The violence was precise, professional, the work of someone who killed before. Security footage from neighboring homes captured 2 suspects fleeing the scene, but their faces were obscured, their identities unknown. What police didn't realize immediately was that this wasn't a random home invasion or robbery gone wrong. It was a targeted hit order from hundreds of miles away by a former Olympic athlete who decided these victims knew too much. The deceased were a couple in their 50s with no apparent connection to the drug trade. They were collateral damage, killed because a family member had allegedly stolen cocaine from Wedding's organization. In Wedding's world, debts were paid in blood, and family connections offered no protection. The message was clear to anyone in his network. Cross him, and everyone you love becomes a target. As homicide detectives worked the Ontario case, DEA agents in California were tracking something bigger. Wiretaps on suspected drug traffickers had picked up coded conversations referencing someone called the Canadian and the Olympian. At first, these seemed like random nicknames in the criminal underworld. But as agents dug deeper, analyzing travel patterns, financial transactions, and communications, a pattern emerged that pointed directly to Ryan Wedding. The DEA discovered that Wedding had established a sophisticated cocaine pipeline running from Mexico through Southern California and up to Canada. His operation used stash houses in Los Angeles to store massive quantities of cocaine before distribution. Couriers, many of them unaware of who actually controlled the operation, transported drugs in vehicles equipped with hidden compartments. The network moved product with stunning efficiency, sometimes shifting hundreds of kilograms in a single week. But what made Wedding's operation particularly dangerous was his willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened it. Federal investigators identified at least 3 additional murders potentially connected to his organization. A low-level dealer in Los Angeles who'd been skimming product, a courier arrested in Washington state who might cooperate with authorities, a rival trafficker trying to establish competing routes into Canada. Each had been killed execution style, professional hits that sent unmistakable messages throughout the criminal underworld. Wedding himself remained frustratingly elusive. He'd learned from years in the drug trade how to avoid surveillance, how to compartmentalize his organization, so that lower-level operatives never met him directly. He used encrypted communications, burner phones, and trusted intermediaries to insulate himself from direct evidence. Even as investigators built their case, Wedding moved freely between Mexico and various locations in North America, always one step ahead of law enforcement. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Wedding's couriers, a young man in his 20s facing decade in prison, decided cooperation was his only chance at survival. He provided investigators with detailed information about the organization's structure, its routes, its methods of operation. More importantly, he confirmed what agents had suspected. Ryan Wedding wasn't just a figurehead or investor. He was the architect in command of the entire enterprise, making final decisions on shipments, distribution, and enforcement. With his testimony and months of accumulated evidence, federal prosecutors in Los Angeles convened a grand jury. The indictment they prepared was devastating. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine, running a continuing criminal enterprise, money laundering, and most shocking, multiple count of murder in aid of racketeering. The charges carried potential life sentences, possibly even the death penalty. In October 2024, the indictment was unsealed. Coordinated raids across multiple states and Canadian provinces resulted in 16 arrests. Wedding's associates, his trusted lieutenants, his couriers and enforcers, all were taken into custody simultaneously. Millions in cash was seized. Kilograms of cocaine were recovered from stash houses. Luxury vehicles, properties, and financial accounts were frozen. But Ryan Wedding himself wasn't among those arrested. Intelligence suggested he'd fled to Mexico months earlier, possibly tipped off by someone within his organization that law enforcement was closing in. He had cartel connections there, protection money already paid, safe houses where he could hide indefinitely. The former Olympian had become a ghost, a fugitive with resources and ruthlessness enough to evade capture. The FBI added him to their MostWanted list, offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. His photograph, older now than his Olympic days, harder around the eyes, appeared on wanted posters across North America. The caption beneath his image listed his alleged crimes in stark detail: international drug trafficking, murder, organized crime leadership. As Wedding's former associates began cooperating with prosecutors, a fuller picture emerged of the man behind the empire. Those who'd worked with him described someone charismatic but paranoid, generous with trusted allies but merciless toward anyone who failed him. He'd maintained the physical fitness of his athletic days, staying ready to flee or fight at any moment. He'd studied cartel operations, learned Spanish, built relationships with some of Mexico's most dangerous criminal organizations. Former friends from his snowboarding days expressed shock and disbelief. They remembered Ryan as ambitious, perhaps overly so, but never imagined he was capable of orchestrating murders. His family, devastated by the revelations, struggled to reconcile the athlete they'd supported with the criminal he'd become. His Olympic dreams, once a source of pride, now seemed like cruel irony, a reminder of potential utterly wasted. The investigation continued expanding. Financial forensics revealed that Wedding's operation had moved an estimated 700 kilograms of cocaine and generated over $450 million in drug proceeds over several years. The money had been laundered through real estate purchases, cryptocurrency transactions, and shell companies spanning multiple countries. His network had employed dozens of people, many unaware they were working for a former Olympian turned drug lord. But despite the arrests and evidence, one critical question remained unanswered. Where was Ryan Wedding now? Mexican authorities claimed they were searching, but cartel territories are vast and cooperation with foreign law enforcement is complicated by corruption and political considerations. Wedding had money, connections, and motivation to stay hidden. He knew what awaited him if captured: life in prison or worse. As 2024 drew to a close, the manhunt intensified. International warrants were issued. Interpol alerts went out to law enforcement agencies worldwide. The FBI's Transnational Organized Crime Division made his capture a top priority. But Wedding remained at large, somewhere in the shadows, a former athlete who traded Olympic glory for a criminal empire and was now living as a fugitive, knowing that every day of freedom might be his last. December 2024. Ryan Wedding had been a fugitive for 8 months, his face plastered across international wanted posters, his former life as an Olympic athlete now forever tainted by accusations of murder and drug trafficking. But while he hid somewhere in Mexico's vast criminal underground, his empire was collapsing around him. His associates, once loyal soldiers in his cocaine network, were now sitting in interrogation rooms across North America, making deals to save themselves from life sentences. The prosecution's case was being built brick by brick, testimony by testimony. Former couriers described how Wedding's operation worked, the sophisticated methods used to move hundreds of kilograms of cocaine across borders. Financial experts trace money flows through shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets, documenting how Wedding had accumulated a fortune estimated at over $450 million. Most damning were the witnesses who could connect Wedding directly to the murders, the enforcement actions he'd ordered to protect his territory and silence potential informants. One cooperating witness provided chilling details about Wedding's transformation from athlete to killer. He described a meeting where Wedding had calmly ordered the execution of a courier who'd been arrested, fearing the man might cooperate with police. There was no anger in Wedding's voice, no emotion at all. It was simply business, a problem that needed solving. The witness remembered thinking in that moment that the man sitting across from him bore no resemblance to the Olympic hopeful who'd once competed for national glory. That person was gone, replaced by someone who viewed human life as expendable. The families of Wedding's victims attended every court hearing involving his co-defendants, seeking whatever justice they could find while the man who'd ordered their loved ones' deaths remained free. The couple murdered in Ontario, killed simply because a relative had allegedly stolen from Wedding's organization, left behind children and grandchildren who would never understand why their family had been destroyed. Their daughter spoke at sentencing hearings, her voice breaking as she described the senseless violence that had shattered their lives. Federal prosecutors in Los Angeles prepared for trials that would likely span months. The evidence was overwhelming, but without Wedding himself in custody, there was a frustrating incompleteness to proceedings. His co-defendants were facing justice, receiving sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison, but the architect of the entire criminal enterprise remained at large, living somewhere beyond the reach of American and Canadian law. Then, in late November 2024, a breakthrough. Mexican authorities received intelligence that Wedding was hiding in a compound near Guadalajara, protected by members of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. The information came from an unlikely source, a cartel member who'd been arrested on unrelated charges, and was willing to trade Wedding's location for consideration in his own case. Mexican federal police, working with DEA agents, began planning a raid. The operation was launched in the early morning hours of December 10th. Over 50 heavily armed officers surrounded the compound, a fortified property with high walls and security cameras. Wedding had been living there for months, paying the cartel for protection, believing he was untouchable. When police breached the gates, they expected resistance, possibly a firefight. What they found instead was Wedding attempting to flee through a back exit, carrying a backpack filled with cash and fake identification documents. He was taken into custody without incident, though witnesses reported he remained defiant, insisting authorities had no jurisdiction, that Mexico wouldn't extradite him. But Wedding had miscalculated. The severity of his crimes, the international cooperation involved in his capture, and pressure from both American and Canadian governments meant extradition was inevitable. Within 48 hours, he was on a plane to Los Angeles, shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit, the former Olympian now just another criminal facing justice. His first appearance in federal court drew massive media attention. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters from major networks jockeyed for position. Inside the courtroom, Wedding appeared thinner than in his wanted photos, his face hardened by months on the run. He stood before the judge as charges were read, each one carrying potential for life imprisonment. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine, leading a continuing criminal enterprise, money laundering, and most serious, multiple count of murder and aid of racketeering. Wedding's attorney entered a not guilty plea, but everyone in that courtroom knew the evidence was insurmountable. Wiretaps, financial records, cooperating witnesses, forensic evidence connecting him to the murders. The prosecution had built a case that would be nearly impossible to defend against. The only question was whether Wedding would eventually accept a plea deal or force the government to prove every charge at trial. As the case proceeded through preliminary hearings, more details emerged about the scope of Wedding's operation and the lives destroyed by his ambition. Investigators estimate his network had distributed over 700 kilograms of cocaine over several years, flooding streets with drugs that contributed to addiction, overdoses, and crime in communities across North America. Beyond the direct victims of his organization's violence, countless others had suffered collateral damage from the poison he'd helped spread. Former teammates and coaches from Wedding's snowboarding days struggled to reconcile the person they'd known with the criminal he'd become. Some refused to believe it, insisting there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. Others admitted they'd seen warning signs even during his athletic career, and ruthless competitiveness that seemed to go beyond normal ambition, a willingness to bend rules, a lack of empathy for those he viewed as obstacles. The psychological question haunted everyone who'd followed the case. How does an Olympic athlete, someone who represents the pinnacle of dedication and achievement, become a drug lord responsible for multiple murders? Experts suggested that the same drive that pushes athletes to Olympic levels can, when misdirected, fuel criminal ambition. Wedding had wanted to win at snowboarding and had fallen short. In the drug trade, he'd found an arena where his competitive nature and strategic thinking could bring the success he craved, regardless of the human cost. By January 2025, with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of multiple life sentences, Wedding's attorneys began plea negotiations. The prosecution was willing to consider a deal that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation, detailed information about cartel contacts, and assistance in dismantling what remained of his network. But Wedding, even facing certain conviction, seemed unable to fully accept responsibility for what he'd done. In court filings, his lawyers argued for reduced charges, claimed he'd been coerced by cartel partners, suggested he was less culpable than the evidence indicated. The judge presiding over the case made clear that such arguments would fail. The evidence showed Wedding as the leader, the decision-maker, the person who built and commanded the entire operation. His Olympic past would not shield him from consequences. His athletic achievements meant nothing in the face of the violence and destruction he'd caused. As the case moved toward trial, scheduled for spring 2025, one thing became certain. Ryan Wedding would spend the rest of his life in prison. Whether through plea deal or conviction at trial, whether in American or Canadian custody, his days of freedom were over. The former Olympian who'd once dreamed of standing on a podium with a medal around his neck would instead spend decades in a cell, his legacy forever defined not by athletic achievement, but by the criminal empire he'd built and the lives he'd destroyed. The victims' families attended every hearing, maintaining vigil, ensuring that even if Wedding refused to acknowledge his crimes, his victims would not be forgotten. They wore photographs of their loved ones, held press conferences, spoke about the devastation his organization had caused. Their presence was a constant reminder that behind the sensational headlines and true crime fascination, real people had suffered real loss. In the end, Ryan Wedding's story became a cautionary tale about ambition without conscience, about how the same qualities that can drive success can also fuel destruction when morality is abandoned. He'd wanted to be remembered, to achieve something significant. He'd succeeded, but not in any way he'd imagined as a young athlete with Olympic dreams. He would be remembered as a murderer, a drug trafficker, a man who threw away every opportunity, and became exactly what society least values. The manhunt was over. The fugitive was captured. But for the families of his victims, for the communities damaged by his drugs, for everyone who believed in the ideals the Olympics represent, the pain would continue long after Ryan Wedding disappeared into the federal prison system. Some cases end with closure. This one ended with the bitter knowledge that a person capable of Olympic-level achievement had chosen instead to excel at causing harm, and that choice had left scars that would never fully heal.